As promised, the panel discussion on infrastructure at India Economic Conclave has just started, and as you see, Sanjeev Aga, the ex-MD of IDEA, is hosting him. Let's listen.
My first question to Dr. Ahluwalia, but this is in fact something I would have liked to ask him if I ever got a chance to meet him, because he is a veteran of the Indian Long March. He's been involved with reforms since 1991, and there are not that many people. And I would like to advance a hypothesis that the building block of the 91 reforms was the 8-digit ITC harmonized system code. I was a manager, I've been a manager both in manufacturing, consumer and infra, and I interfaced and took some of these reforms on the chin. But I think the starting point of any reform is making codes, is codifying. If you do not codify, you can't take the second or the third step. And I think that is the most undersung piece of advancement in policy that happened over 20 years ago. And I think a large part of the manufacturing sector went through revolutionary change because of that. But when you come to infrastructure, how do you codify, say, a hydrocarbon deposit? How do you codify minerals? How do you codify spectrum? And our inability to codify has meant that we have not been able to frame rules. In fact, I would like to advance the hypothesis that rules cannot be framed. You need larger principles. And in a sense, the 1991 reforms have bypassed the infrastructure sector. So in a way, infrastructure remains in policy terms, in governance terms, and being deliberately provocative in the dark ages. And we have not as a country been able to summon the reserves of energy to take on this next challenge, which is a bigger policy challenge and also an intellectual challenge. I would request Dr. Ahluwalia to contradict or add.
Well, let me say that, of course, I agree that infrastructure at the moment is actually the most important thing. I don't actually agree with you at all that codification is the problem. I mean, in 1991, if we had done the harmonization and then adopted the policy of having 200% protection for everybody, I don't think the codification would have made a difference. Nor does the basic policy decision, industrial licensing, get rid of MRTP, lower tariffs, open up. This had nothing to do with whether you had a codified system. You didn't have a codified system. And I don't believe that if you had codified infrastructure, that these problems would have disappeared. So my first suggestion is, I agree with you that infrastructure is the key thing we should be focusing on. In my view, it was not the key thing in 91 because there were so many other low-hanging fruits. There's no point focusing on infrastructure if Indian companies that wanted to expand were not being allowed to expand, and if they did expand, they were being prosecuted for having violated some ridiculous industrial license rules. That was the right thing to do. Probably around about the 11th plan, we shifted the focus a lot to infrastructure. And I think there are some real problems there. We can discuss what they are. Government doesn't deny that this is a complex area. And, you know, it's not just the natural resource areas that you touched upon, spectrum. Those things, to be honest, are really quite simple. I mean, both in coal and spectrum, the most important thing is that the government continued with the policy that had been in place before the government came in. That policy became controversial. Government was very clear that we need to move to a different policy, and they said we're moving, and they have moved. I mean, spectrum is being auctioned, coal is being auctioned. But the focus is what was going on when it wasn't being auctioned. The big difference, if you ask me, between now and 1991 is in 1991, nobody's shone a light on how licenses were given in the last 3 years. If you had subjected the activities of the then Chief Controller of Imports and Exports for the previous 4 years, on what basis did someone get an import license and what basis did they not get an import license, you would have had exactly the mess that you have right now. Now, the reason why this is maybe higher demands for governance. That's also good in the long run. But let's be quite clear about it. In the key areas of infrastructure, some very important things have been done. There have been some very major successes. And for example, the private investment in power generation is a huge success. In fact, the big problem is that there wasn't a comparable success in coal. And that is because that particular part didn't get reformed at all. And furthermore, that is a part where it's not just, the industry is nationalized, there are land acquisition problems, there are environmental problems, there are forest clearance problems. And frankly, those are not issues on which the country is actually united. And maybe we need a clearer focus so that all the different stakeholders that have different views come forward. To my mind, what we need is clarity. I mean, for example, if it is indeed the view of the country that 30% of our coal should never be mined, one can write out the implications of that. Just assume that we don't have that much coal, we're going to have to import coal, coal prices are going to rise, power prices are going to rise, you're going to adjust to a much higher energy price. There's no consensus on that, but there's a huge pressure that you mustn't do any coal mining. Now, we need to address that issue. And I'm not saying, by the way, that those issues, nor am I actually saying that we've solved the problem. We obviously haven't, we're trying to. But I really do not think codification has any bearing on it whatsoever.
One more question, sir, and let me try and push you from another angle. How long can a country which has a tryst with destiny wait for consensus on specialist subjects, which really even many of us can't understand? Let's look at two things which have worked, two institutions. One is the Reserve Bank of India. How would it have been if we had waited for consensus building on monetary policy? What would it have done for the country? But we have built an institution before independence. Let's take another institution which you had, which was done, I don't know, maybe soon after independence, but probably in the early 50s. I have not heard a single person say, Dr. Ahluwalia, has your decisions influence profits up or down in a massive way? But I have not heard one whisper that Dr. of the Reserve Bank has got this interest or that interest in mind. So, if a sector is specialized, it is complex, it necessarily has to be administered as it is done in almost all advanced countries by institutions, not necessarily by government departments and ministries. So along with reforms of 1990s, or maybe as you said 1990s was premature, but maybe 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, or maybe now, do you think the time has come to move this away? Is it breaking the jinx? Because jinx gives an impression that is bad luck. Is it bad luck, or do we need to break the mold? And if we need to break the mold, why is it that we are not doing well in infrastructure? There has to be a reason.
My own view is that you can always look for a perfect system, and there are many things we can and should do with the present system that would actually make it a lot better. But breaking the mold and all these they're dramatic phrases. I think one of the important things that we have done in, let's say institutionally, probably the most important thing that has been done, and it was really done in the 11th plan, you can say, it began earlier but was made a very clear strategy. The totally clear recognition that A, infrastructure is very important, and B, given the limited resources available with the government, which have to go into health and education and these soft infrastructure kind of things, the infrastructure we need cannot be delivered if you rely on the public sector alone. It's a very major strategic decision. If the political consensus is no, we have to do the health and we have to do the education. Don't have the money. Now, I think that we built a consensus. People are quite happy that the private sector is investing. But what has happened is, you've got a multiplicity of problems. They're not all the same. In some areas, you've come up against the regulatory problem. Now, that has to be handled separately. I don't believe you can do it by setting up institutions. Very often, you need just clarity. A lot of our regulations, for example, haven't been given enough thought. I've been arguing internally that, for example, a lot of regulations on environment, there's not enough consultation amongst the development side and the others to make sure that what comes out is actually a good balance. That doesn't require breaking the mold. It just requires establishing a very clear mechanism where you don't do something without adequate consultation. There are other issues which are institutional. I mean, you start a public-private partnership, private guys come along, they bid for a project, they agree on certain things. Now, the rest of the world moves on, things change, and immediately a demand would be raised, well look, the earlier conditions don't apply, can you tweak something? How do you handle that? Maybe Dr. Rangarajan is currently examining exactly this issue in the case of road projects. See, the point is, when you do something different and you do it in a democratic environment where there's a lot of room for debate, and you're doing it in an election year where, I mean, the nature of an election year is politics is adversarial. So if anybody can point a finger at something, they will. So I think you just got to recognize that things are not going to move as fast as you want. But on the positive side, I think the need for special problem-solving mechanisms was recognized last year. And the government said, look, let's set up something called the Cabinet Committee on Investment. Now, you know, this is a very important mechanism because in our system, every regulation is run by one ministry. What the government did is that when you've got differences, they actually could be pulled into the Cabinet Committee on Investment and an overall view taken. A secretariat was set up in the Cabinet Secretariat which is looking at problem projects. Now, I was just talking to the person who runs it. They listed about 300 and something apparently problem projects. They've been able to resolve the problems of approximately 120 of them simply by sort of internal consultation and telling the ministry, come on, get on with it, why is it getting delayed, etc. About 20 of the projects will have to go to the CCI because there are strong differences. I mean, that would mean out of 330, at least 150 projects will have got these regulatory problems and clearances resolved. But you know, this is happening at a time when the financial system has choked up a bit, not just in India but globally. And people have overinvested and many of them are finding financial constraints. So even if you get rid of these regulatory clearances, it's not as if the project is suddenly going to boom. But you've got to get rid of these clearances, other things will stabilize and then they'll move forward. So I think you shouldn't be looking, it's too complicated to look for what I would call a magic solution or a reinventing. I think you need to be very result oriented. We've got the system we've got. It would take far too long to change it. But you can always tell where it's non-performing. And if you're determined to resolve it, it can be resolved. And probably from that resolution will come a better understanding of how the system should evolve. I'm not in favor of the view that, you know, we say, well, this is not functioning, let's break the mold and reinvent the system. And it'll take you years to get agreement on that. So it's a different approach.
I picked a wrong phrase, but I'll come back to. Before I come to Dan, I wanted to ask you, in your role as a banker, but you are on FICCI and you have every role. But Ravi, I just want to push you. Dr. Ahluwalia used the word adversarial, and we have a system of checks and balances. And I'm not talking of changing let me not use the word breaking the mold or changing the rules or changing the system, but just mindsets. Is it necessary that environment should be adversarial to a project? Should it be a yes/no? Or would it not occur that we could work along with the project and say no only if things come to a head? In the previous two sessions in the morning before lunch, I kept hearing taking decisions, not taking decisions, taking mala fide decisions, taking bona fide decisions. But I've also worked for decades and I'd never thought of my job as taking decisions. It's a mindset, it's a magisterial mindset that things come up to you and you'll either sign or not sign. So is there in your opinion, in all these things which makes things yes, no, and prolongs time, instead of problem solving and getting it over, do you think an environment or many of these things, although they may not necessarily directly interact with you, do you think there's an issue there?
I think when it comes to the infrastructure projects, it's very important there must be a kind of consensus both at the state and the national level what has to be done. It should not be one proposes, the other one disposes, or put stumbling blocks there. This is precisely that we are finding it today. We do get support some cases from center, but the state level they bring up a multitude of issues whereby it's a complete showstopper. I do agree with Dr. Ahluwalia that there was a time when it was only state institutions, public institutions which were doing the infrastructure, but now the private sector has come in a big way. Even if you look at the 12th plan document, it's saying 50% of the investment has to come from private sector. And if you look at, Dr. Chaudhary is here, in the power sector, in the last plan, 11th plan, more than 50% capacity has been added by the private sector. Private sector is the one which has brought buoyancy to the telecom sector. Every sector where we have done well, private sector played a big role. Having said that, and I just want to point out, Dr. Odi, I slightly beg to disagree with you here, that in the 11th plan, a lot of private sector companies came as joint generation projects. But if you look at the year 12-13, I can't think of any private project which is taking off now. Because there's such an atmosphere of uncertainty. I don't know what the regulators are going to do. They feel very intimidated. I think this is the kind of thing which is going to be a big showstopper. So if the regulatory environment, we should declare it, make sure that it's known to people, and the regulators, create a positive environment rather than an environment in which people feel highly insecure about what is going to happen next. I don't want to take time with this forum, but I know many projects where billions of dollars have been invested, but they are not able to take off because of small reasons. It's like a pendulum between state and center to state. Even after CCI has, taken off and trying to give thrust, but not many of them have taken off. So I do agree that, in India we used to grow at a small rate, and now that rate has increased dramatically. Some of the issues which were not problems like coal linkages and coal availability have suddenly become big issues. But as long as we can hold the bull by the horn and create very speedily a policy framework, they can be handled. The coal issue to my mind is not a big issue. This issue, India has proven reserves of nearly 200 billion tons. We continue to mine less than 500 million tons, and coal is not going to be, a useful source of energy for very long. So what are we trying to preserve? What are we trying to serve? This is one issue. The second is, which I definitely would like to bring this forum, the lack of integrated planning. We have Ministry of Power, we have Ministry of Oil and Gas, we have Renewables Energy, and Ministry of Coal separately. And therefore what happens, there's a lot of file moving between ministry to ministry, and decisions don't come. But if you bring everything under the umbrella of what we call Ministry of Energy, and supported by very able regulators, I think it can make a tremendous difference.
Well, let me ask Mr. Chaudhary, assuming he was that very able regulator with undiluted powers, and let me turn to the sector of power, which is perhaps, looks almost gridlocked at the moment, and let us ignore the coal issue as a passing issue, however politically charged it may be at this point of time, and however impoverishing. Let us just ignore that. If you were that dictator, would you do what is the current method? Would you do more of that? Would you sort of de-bottleneck? Or would you like to do things somewhat differently?
I don't know whether the regulator is a dictator, but...
Well, I'm using... I had no other...
Since you raised the power sector, and I think Dr. Ahluwalia did a great service to the power generating sector, by virtue of which today you are with this huge amount of capacity that we have in the country in generation. But then down the line somebody should have integrated the other thing also, the fuel required for generation, the transmission and distribution, and I think what you meant was the utilities distributing the power and collecting the money which is disturbing the banks today. That's the sole reason why all the power projects are becoming the banks to fund. I believe very strongly what Ravi said, to actually plan for our own power requirement with our own coal. And a coal regulator is highly required, not because it's a regulator, the word is wrong. Somebody who assures a return to a private investor that you come and invest in coal, you get this kind of returns. It's very simple, because there is a power regulator who looks at these things and says, what is your return? So one thing is, those who invest in the private sector, first of all, if they come into infrastructure, somehow the real estate given us a very bad emphasis. We are not, infrastructure investment is not a windfall investment. It's also not good for fly-by-night people. If you put in money today, you keep earning for the next 40 years. That's how we invest. But the problem with these SEBs are different. It's more on a political and social issue. And it is because I know the CCI was mentioned. I know Dr. Ahluwalia said that they have handled many things. But I know personally CCI decisions are not happening on the ground, because the CCI is not actually involving the state government. Now the CCI gives a decision, we go to implement it on the ground, the state government puts all sorts of obstructions in putting it through. So we are not thinking as a nation on the power sector, on the infrastructure sector. We are all doing our work in silos very well, but it's not gelling in together to really get the end result that we took this decision and this got implemented. And then we say, okay, we took it, it got implemented. That's not happening. And the power, even with our own coal, people are not able to afford the power, because there is a wrong feeling which is given, and especially this is election time, as Dr. Ahluwalia rightly said, that the feeling is given probably the power will be given free. Power has an economic cost. 75% of the cost is the cost of fuel, it's passed through. So, I mean, whether it's passed through or not, that's the cost. So somebody has to bear that cost. So probably if the whole chain, somebody looks at the financial returns on the whole chain, this whole sector will look differently. And sir, since you looked at the generation, maybe you could give us a lead into the end part of it also, the distribution and realizing the money, that's what is actually the bottleneck today.
Well, that's of course the panel discussion on infrastructure, but a reminder of the big one as well. Do not miss the keynote address